Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Hustle Network podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us. His name is Roger Gu. Roger was one of the co founders of the original Embers, a card technology startup that was acquired in mid 2019. He now leads card product strategy across the organization. Roger has fintech experience through his prior roles of leading merchant acceptance of Bitcoin at Coinbase and corporate strategy at Visa. Roger holds degrees in economics and finance from Princeton University. He and his wife have a life goal to visit all 60 of the US national parks. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And I think it's like 61 or 62 that the list has been updated a little bit in terms of national parks, but it's still a goal of ours.
Wow, I mean, just to hop on that topic real quick, how far along are you on that goal?
Uh, about halfway. So this past year, my wife and I have the luxury of being remote, since we're both in tech. So we spent the last year Airbnb across most of the Western United States. So we knocked out a lot in that regard, especially going to Arizona and Utah.
I like that. That's a very awesome goal. Like it's something that I personally want to do one day. But unfortunately, I'm not very outdoorsy at all. But yeah, let's hop into our first question. So Roger, tell us more about yourself and your upbringing. Where'd you grow up, and what was that like for you?
So I grew up in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. My parents had a Chinese restaurant in a small little town called Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey, and spent pretty much. I did elementary to high school there. Wanted to get as far away as I could, so I applied to a couple schools in California for college. Got into Berkeley, was super pumped about that. Uh, Wound up going to Princeton. So once I didn't expect it. It was such a long shot for me. But my parents, there's a lot of pressure, so I applied anyways. Um, Somehow got in. Was super thrilled by that, and their financial package was just so good. There's no way I could have passed that up, even if I wanted to live the hippie lifestyle out west. So wound up in college in New Jersey as well. Now currently in California. So once I could eventually move out west, so that was definitely one of my early on dreams. Um, so I've been working professionally for about 10 years, largely focused in fintech. Certainly not something that I had aimed for even after graduation in college. I did the very standard track. I was an investment banker. Did that for 2 years. It was a really tough time because I graduated college in 2009, so there wasn't that much M&A activity back then. Um, Switched over to consulting. Tried that for a little bit. That was for Visa, which Maggie, thank you for bringing up a little bit earlier on the corporate strategy side. From Visa, went to Coinbase. Coinbase afterwards started in Burst and been here for about the past 5 years.
Wow, that's quite the journey, man. And I think one thing you really point out to me is like in 2009, I agree. I graduated in 2010. It's so hard to find a job during that time period, and it's very depressing because you're like, man, like where's my life going? Everything I've been trying, it's not working out. I realized that from that time period, there's a lot of entrepreneurs during that time period because we're just like, you know what, we gotta focus on ourselves, focus on our business. So I can totally relate
Oh
to you
yeah,
with that
totally.
mindset.
I had my offer rescinded by one of the top three investment banks.
Oh my god.
And what I remember the most tragic was I was like delaying signing the signing bonus because it was like a $12,000 signing bonus. And had I just signed and then they rescinded, I would have at least gotten $12,000. But I was waiting like couple like waiting for a couple options, trying to play it. So fortunately that didn't work out. But that was really a tough time. But I am glad in that regard that it definitely worked out well for me. Had I done that, I think I would have wound up. The offer was for Hong Kong, so I would have done rates trading, structured rates trading in Hong Kong, and my then girlfriend, my now wife, probably with that relationship probably wouldn't have gone as well doing long distance between Hong Kong and New Jersey. So all worked out for the best.
Yeah, look at that chain effect. Like at that time, it probably must have felt terrible that happened, right? But hindsight 2020, you look back, you're like, wow, I'm kind of glad that did happen. And that's the case for a lot of people too. I want to take a bigger step backwards too. Like have you ever thought you'd be like an entrepreneur at this point in your life? Like, has that seed ever occurred any point of your life where it's like you were taught that while you were at Princeton, or your parents wanted you to be entrepreneurs? Like how did that seed sort of like fell into your lap and sort of made you think like, hey, why not me? Like, why can't I be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I was going to ask that too, because, with your fintech experience, I personally resonate with that as well, because my parents had always wanted me to do something in the finance industry, something very stable. So I want to know like where you got the entrepreneurial spirit from.
So when I was growing up, I had my parents gave me three options for careers. One was lawyer, two was doctor, three was in finance. So I had a lot of options between those three, right? So not really that much in terms of influence from my parents per se, although they did pass on a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit to me because the fact that they immigrated to America with very little, and then they started a Chinese restaurant in this small little town in New Jersey, and just kind of grinded away working. They worked 364 and a half days a year. So the only day off that they had was the dinner for Thanksgiving. They took off. Every other day they worked. So I always had that drive, but like I wanted to do it better, right? Like I saw how hard they worked. I did not want to work that hard. It's like, okay, let me get ahead right now. Let me put in put in the work now into my studies, so that I wouldn't have to work the way that my parents did, right? Like they sacrificed essentially for the benefit that I could really take advantage of. So I wasn't about to throw that away. Um, I was on a very stable career path, right? So it was investment banking for 2 years. I did consulting, Visa for 2 years. Um, I think what essentially kind of, it wasn't like, oh my God, I want to start a new business. I have this like drive to start a new business. It was more like I want my work to be meaningful. During that time, I remember distinctly, I thought this, now it sounds kind of silly saying it, but there was like a life calculator and it showed it to the seconds, right? So it's like a little countdown, but it showed it to the seconds digit. And so, a little bit of that was just like impetus, like, what am I doing? What am I spending my time on? And I created a lot of decks through investment banking and then as a strategy consultant at Visa. Like my deck making capabilities are fire, right? My Excel skills, they certainly have deteriorated. But back then I could make a model like no one else. So I created all these models. I created all these like just really good decks, but did it really accomplish anything? Like was I leading any projects? Was I having meaningful impact towards the team's goals and more broadly towards the company's goals? And I didn't feel that. So it was that drive that really made me trying to start exploring something new. It wasn't initially the goal of I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to create my own company. It wasn't that at all.
Yeah, I mean that's extremely relatable to a lot of us, and I appreciate you breaking it down to like seconds in the time, because that just shows like your sense of urgency that you had. You're just at one point you just stop and reevaluate your life, and you're like, wait a minute, like what am I doing? I'm just making all these decks, but I want to have more impact. I think that's like the origin story for most entrepreneurs you have on the podcast. It's almost like, wait a minute, what am I doing in my life? Just take a step back and reevaluate everything, create that sense of urgency to create more. So let's quickly talk more about your time at Coinbase. I know like that was like probably the job before you started your company, right? What was the
Right.
turning point of like joining Coinbase and being a director of partnerships there, and then now becoming your own CEO of your own company? Like, what was the transition process like? I mean, it couldn't have been easy. Like Coinbase is one of the hottest startups out there, right? And to leave that, start your own startup because you were so convicted with this idea. What was the process like for you?
And on top
So
of that, you left Coinbase in October 2015 and started Embers in October 2015. So I love to hear about just that fast transition and jump.
Coinbase was one of the most fun times I've had, right? Because I joined in the teens and I left when we were about 80, 90 headcount or so. And growing that quickly along with the crypto crowd really gaining popularity, that was just a lot of fun, right? It was one of the most challenging things I've ever done, but certainly the community that the crypto community, the Coinbase community, they're saying that like a lot of similar to like kind of the PayPal mafia, a lot of the early Coinbase folks have started their own startups. Unfortunately, not as successful as the early PayPal guys, but certainly it was probably one of the most educational experiences for me as well. Certainly much more so than my time at Visa, even compared to like, college and investment banking days. It was a new challenge every single day. And it was such a small team. And one of the goals that we had was like, all right, how do we broaden the adoption of cryptocurrencies? And, we were talking about P2P transfers, peer-to-peer, but we were also talking about, just doing standard merchant payments. And right before I joined was the first merchant that, well-known merchant that accepted Bitcoin. It was overstock.com. They had huge publicity from accepting Bitcoin. And I joined a month after that news, essentially. And, we were saying, we had a lot of demand from our users to say like, hey, I want to be able to buy more things with crypto, not just overstock.com, which caters towards a fairly different audience than the crypto community. And so we reached out to a whole bunch of merchants and, got a lot of small brands, but also got some sizable deals. So I led the Bitcoin integration for Dell.com. So I flew out to Round Rock, had a great time with the guys there. That was a 4-month project. We did Dish Network, Wikipedia, Stripe, Braintree. So it was pretty heavy adoption from the merchant side, like just in a very short amount of time. The issue was like, we weren't seeing continued user usage of Bitcoin. So they would, maybe upon the first news, they'll try it out. They'll buy a couple items, but we weren't seeing that continued usage of crypto to procure goods. So that was, certainly a very interesting challenge, and I learned a tremendous amount about not only just crypto but banking in general, and that's kind of what led me to eventually, co-found in Burst with my co-founder Peter Lai. I had worked on the last project before I left was the Bitcoin debit card, which you swipe $10, it would immediately draw from your Coinbase wallet, convert $10 worth of Bitcoin into USD, and then pay off the merchant. And so a lot of that, similar concepts, similar controls, similar capabilities there, as what eventually became in Burst, which was card expenses for companies.
Awesome. Let's talk more about Embers. It's I think it's a really, really cool company, cool technology. You guys are leveraging, artificial intelligence as well. Like tell our listeners more about Embers. Like what is it? What product is it, and what problem does it solve?
Simply put, we really want the ability for companies to be able to spend on whatever they need and not worry about reconciliation, right? It's extremely manual, it's time consuming. You'd be surprised about the number of companies, even till this day, that are using, Excel to track their expenses or, more antiquated, software. We want them to bring them to the modern age of expenses where folks can ask for funds, they can get a card, spend it, and then just kind of forget about it, right? We want to make it as seamless as possible. These days, especially when a lot of folks are remote, myself included, I have to buy my own supplies. I have to, have a lot of software subscriptions on myself. I have, occasionally still have a little bit of travel and entertainment expenses, although not as much these days. I don't want to worry about having paper receipts and having to keep track of what the budget was for my team or how much I'm spending on XYZ vendor. I want all that to be automated. So that's essentially what we're trying to do. We want to make it super easy for clients across the world to be able to spend and buy whatever they need and not have to think about the rest. So my company was acquired in 2019. So we were originally just a card expense company. So we can create the card that has these technologies that limit you to what employees can spend on. So, I found it fascinating that the typical expense model, you give someone a corporate card, and Brian, I'll give you a corporate card, and here's an Amex. Oh, it has like a $20,000 limit, but you're only supposed to use up to like 3,000 max. You're only really supposed to use it for travel expenses, and you're not really supposed to use it for any other time period except when you're actually on the road. Well, then why do you have a $20,000 credit card, right? Like that doesn't make any sense, right? And the employer, as the employer, I wouldn't know what you actually spent on until you submitted your expenses, and that could be 2 weeks after your trip, or more common could be like 2 months after your trip. You would actually submit your expenses. So I, as a controller, I have no idea how much has been actually spent. I have no idea what you spent on. I don't know what the budget of the team is. So we thought it made much more sense for the employer to give you a card, or you to request a card specific for the trip. And other times, you have a useless piece of plastic that doesn't have, $20,000. Maybe it has like $100 limit for when you need it, right? And it has limitations on the card itself to say like, hey, I can only use this for United, Marriott, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft. I can't use this at Best Buy. I can't use this on Amazon. Whereas before, it's all manual, right? Everything is just like someone kind of just looking over your expenses, looking over your receipts, seeing if items match. That's really time consuming. And given our current technologies, that's completely unnecessary.
Oh, I love that. It makes so much sense because like Brian and I, we used to work in corporate, and I know Brian used to go on a lot of trips, business trips. And when I went on business trips as well, it was so frustrating to see like, okay, what can I spend this money on? Right. And like, how much money did I have? But at the same time, it's like, you can charge it on anything, right? You didn't really have a limit, but they told you like, you can only use it during this time frame, and you can only use X amount of dollars. And it was just so like tedious to like look through it, and then they tell you to submit your report like a week after you come back maximum, but then
right.
A lot of people don't submit it until like 2 months later, right? And that actually prolongs the process of reimbursement. You have to go through like Concur or Expensify. It was just so many steps. It was so complicated. So I love what you're doing. I did read that you went through this whole process while building the platform, that you spoke with like dozens of CFOs about how they decide between like personal cards or corporate cards. I want to know what type of research you came to a conclusion with for that survey, and what you learned out of that experience.
Yeah, let's talk about the product market fit. I think that's very important, especially as an early stage founder, right? Just trying to figure out like, I'm pretty sure you got like a lot of advice from like a lot of people that you talk to. Like, how do you determine which one sort of fit into your vision and which one should be the next logical step for you guys to build? Because at the very beginning, there's not a lot of resources that you have. So how do you determine that process?
So we definitely did a lot of interviews, but I certainly had my own convictions as well, from my own prior experience. So Maggie, to your point, from being in the corporate world, like one thing that used to really annoy us and that I used to take advantage of as an investment banker was, one of the perks was if you stay past, I think it was like 6:30, you get to expense dinner, and then you get to charge it to the client, right? So what would we do as analysts? Of course, like every single day, we would wait until 6:35 and go buy dinner, send that off, and then work a little bit, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it is, and then go home, right? You kind of take advantage of that system. And then someone would manually check my receipts and make sure that like, oh, okay, well, this was 6:35, it's after 6:30, this is kosher. Oh, this was 6:29, no, that's not kosher. So like I had my own conviction. So it wasn't, I don't think like, in terms of starting a company, like you have to have your own conviction. You need to have an initial hypothesis, like, and have your own experiences within the product or whatever it is that you're trying to sell, that really can serve as an initial template, an initial testing ground. So I had those couple of experiences. I had, my experiences from working at Visa as well as working at a smaller startup, Coinbase, to really kind of help frame the initial sales tactic Peter, my co-founder, Peter Lai, one of the, the best engineers I've ever met, he had a lot of product conviction and I had a lot of sales conviction. And the two of us, funny enough story, we hadn't actually met that long before we actually decided to work together as co-founders. We actually met because of an Uber pool. So we just kind of hit it off. And from there, like when we started chatting about product market fit, we're talking about some of our own prior experiences. So he had a lot of experiences of thinking of expenses and thinking of reconciliation, similar to how you do at Box, where you create these folders and you tag them and everything's kind of readily available in real time. Thinking of everything on the cloud. So, we together, we really jived and formed that initial product market thesis. And then we tested it with dozens of our early employees. We benefited from being part of Y Combinator out in Silicon Valley. But we just begged our friends and family, hey, can you please use this product, right? Of course, I hit up Coinbase, I hit up Brian, and I was like, hey, like, I know I just left, but like I got this new thing, can you please give it a try? And he was really gracious enough to actually, give us a try for a long time, actually. So it was a lot of scrap together, but to your point, Brian, of like having product market vision and knowing what we were doing. We had a little bit. We had some inclination. I think you need a little bit of a hypothesis, but like beyond that, it's a little bit of a guessing game until you hit it off, right? And those months or even years were quite a struggle.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think when you're first building a company, it's all about your own personal conviction, right? Because you're building something that no one else can see except for you. And you have to fully believe that this is your vision or hypothesis that you're turning in the right direction. And as you keep moving, I don't want to get all spiritual here, but like the universe sort of just helps you along the way, like meeting the right people, hearing the right advice, just seeking out the right opportunity because you want that vision to happen so badly. So I think all that sort of factors into like the founder's journey. And then let's quickly talk about the founder journey as well. As you mentioned, you met your co-founder through a Uber pool. Like, as we know, working with a co-founder, you're practically getting married with someone else. You practically got married with him after one date in a car ride. Like, what was like, how were you guys able to work together so cohesively? And more importantly, how were you able to solve your differences in a way that wasn't very destructive for the vision and the idea of the company? So it's easy for you guys to say, like, look, I'm done. Like, we're not getting along. Like, this idea is not going to happen. Like, we're just going to walk our separate ways because we barely know each other, right? But how do you guys continue to form your bond and set yourself so you're so focused on building these companies together?
So one thing that contributed as simultaneously hindered that ability to kind of work together was kind of our stubbornness and our conviction. So both Peter and I, like, we knew that this had potential. And so like we were just like really stubborn, like we're gonna figure it out, we're gonna make it work. Certainly there were lots of times where we clashed, pretty heavily. So I am very thankful for Peter in that early stages of being patient with me. I also thank some of the coaching that we received. So both of us, we found an executive coach. Both of us had strong mentors as well as friends and advisors. Our early investors at Tejman Mar really helped us out as well. So we had folks to vent and bounce ideas off of, and that network. Without that, there's no way I think Peter and I would have ripped our heads off, each other's heads off. That external network was truly like necessary. Like I am also astounded at the fact that sometimes like I meet like a super successful sole founder. It's like, how did you do it? Like it, there were times where I or Peter were just like, wow, today was a really crappy day. In the very early days, for example, we would have fraud losses right on our cards, and they could be $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 at a time. You just like, oh crap, we just lost $30,000. That's a shit day. And we needed to take turns to grieve, to mourn that loss of the $30,000. And so we realized, Peter and I, like, despite all our differences of opinion, our work ethics, we needed each other. Like, there was no way that I could have done that or he could have done that essentially without having the support of each other, as well as the broader network of advisors, investors, friends, and counselors that we had. So it was, it's that old adage, like, it takes a village. In this case, like, it took a lot. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's such an amazing story. And I mean, like Brian and I, we both know how hard it is to work with a co-founder. I mean, there's so many aspects to it, and it really is getting married to the person that you work with. You really have to make sure that you're aligned in every single way. And I love that you and Peter both found that balance and that you guys work together so well. I want to know about.
I wouldn't say, Maggie, that we weren't aligned. I think it's healthy to have conflict, right? Like, you need to have some kind of conflict, right? So I have been with my wife since 2007. Yes, that's right, 2007. And we've had, we're not aligned on a lot of things, right? So it's important to be aligned on, I think, the big picture. But in regards to execution of that, and in regards to the micro prioritizations, I think it's perfectly healthy to have quite a healthy amount of conflict. It's how do you deal with that conflict? How do you overcome that conflict? And that's certainly something that I've had to work on extensively. I continue to work on today by taking external learning courses, by reading, by listening to a lot of podcasts about how to deal with conflict and how to deal when, especially larger teams, and now that I'm part of a larger company, how to deal with a lot of different priorities.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that, differences are very important, because if you just agree on every single thing all the time, obviously you're not going to grow as a company, right? You need different perspectives and you need different feedback in order to challenge each other. So I love that you shared that.
Yeah, I like that a lot too. I want to talk a little bit more about what our listeners want to hear more. It's like, so you have this idea, you have your co-founder. How do you guys begin to scale your company and make the first few hires? Like, they always say the first few hires of your company is the most crucial and important to building what you're trying to build. Like, how were you guys able to hire, like, let's say, for example, your first 10 employees? Like, what was the most important thing that you're looking for in each candidate? Was it their skills and ability? Was there a culture fit? What was the most important thing that you guys were doing as you guys were scaling out at the very beginning?
So I think two things that really benefited us. One was both Peter and I had been in San Francisco and Silicon Valley for a couple of years prior. So both of us had a network. So we knew folks that were, just through professionally as well as our personal lives. We just knew folks that were like, hey, they're not being challenged, or they're just looking for something new. So that really kind of benefited us, right? So we'd be like, hey, I know you're working on blah, 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 blah. Like, come check out our office, have some coffee, just kind of hang out with us a little bit, and then just kind of slowly over time, like, hey, why don't you try contracting with us a little bit? We'll pay you, and just kind of ease our way in. And then suddenly, next thing you know, like, oh, they work for Inverse now. So that was a really good strategy of ours. So we definitely benefited from that. In regards to kind of early hiring, one of the things that we did at Inverse was something that I learned from Coinbase, which was the concept of an extended work trial. So, you can interview folks for a couple hours a day. But what I really liked, and once again, I learned this from Coinbase, was, have the candidate come in. It could be anywhere from 2 days up to a week. We would pay them for that time. He or she would have to take some PTO, certainly from their existing job, but they would work on a project. They would work on some kind of concrete task that any intelligent person would really be able to finish within that allotted time period. It allowed us to really get a sense of their, the candidates' work capabilities, and as well as actually test their production, as opposed to just the kind of their resume and like, what could you potentially do? We could actually see a work product they could present off of that. And then most importantly, Brian, you asked about culture. Well, it lets us actually hang out in the office. It allows us to have a couple meals together, have some coffee or some beers together, and really bond over that that non-professional work setting. Because what we didn't want to do was just hire more Peters and more Rogers, right? This is actually a problem of ours that we identified early, like just being Asian American. Both of us were Asian American males. One of our like 2 hires after that of the 5 were also Asian American males. We're like, crap, we don't want to only hire Asian American males. So, we really tried to diversify and just wanted to meet new people. We didn't want to just assess people that had similar culture fit, as in like they bonded, they jived well with us, they had similar backgrounds with us. We wanted people with different experiences that could really fit in with us, like regardless. So that work trial experience is something that I highly encourage, right? It doesn't have to be a week, which is what we did in the very early days. It could be a day, it could be 2 days, but I think that type of screening also helps out the candidate, right? They can get a better sense of like, it's essentially day one on the job. They can get a sense of like what the team is like, what the culture, quote unquote, is like. And also just get a sense of like, how hard do these guys work? And in interview questions, when you're hiring, like, that's really hard to like be true. Like, how do you know the other side is really being truthful about? You have so much asymmetrical information there.
I love that. I love that you brought up that you noticed that the first 2 hires were of Asian descent and they were male as well. And, it's very, very easy to, bring on hires that, look like us and sound like us, because I think that's just our natural instinct. We have just a natural bias towards that, right? But I love that you diversified and you looked outside of the box and brought on people who were different, and I think that's very important to bring in different perspectives and dynamics and everything like that. So we want to talk about the acquisition in 2019, mid 2019. I think a lot of listeners want to hear a lot about this as well. Tell us about what that process looked like, what you went throughout that whole process, and how you have seen Embers grow from prior to the acquisition to now.
Before we get there, I want to ask you, what was the first thing that you were thinking? You're like, oh my God, they're gonna be acquired, or like, what was that mindset where it was like, oh man, we might be acquired. I'm kind of sad. Like, what was your first initial thought?
Yeah, it was honestly like, I think I flipped between those 2 thoughts, exactly what you just said. 100 different times. It's like, oh my God, we're getting acquired. I don't have to worry like about having to potentially like just crash and burn. On the other hand, it's like, how do I know like this acquisition is going to work well? Am I going to still be able to retain my team? Am I still going to be able to do impart my vision? And Peter was having similar thoughts, right? Like, are we going to be able to still carry out what we wanted to do from the early days, from the onset? And we just kind of flipped back and forth between the 2. So the acquisition actually wasn't initiated by us. It was actually could do an acqui-hire offer by, it was due to an acquisition offer by one of our partners. Turned out to be a little bit of an acqui-hire offer, but we didn't know that at the time. So, we had worked with ex-partner for quite some time. They approached us saying that like, hey, like, we like working with you. There's good team fit. There was good product fit. And so that's kind of what was the impetus behind that. It was good timing as well, because we had been doing these corporate card expenses, but we didn't know what so one of the things what we were weak on was that we had this corporate card that you could give to your employees and they could spend on that card, right? And we would reconcile all the expenses on that card just fine. The things that we didn't do well on was like, okay, but what if someone had to use their personal card and they have to submit for reimbursement? And then how do you take all those personal card expenses and how do you then get those transactions over to QuickBooks or NetSuite or Intact, all the financial software on the back end? So we didn't do a good job with addressing those points yet, right? It was like, okay, if we're going to scale, we would have to address those 2 points quite quickly. So once we got an initial acquisition offer, we just started started having a couple conversations with investors, having a couple of conversations with advisors. And they said like, hey, like, market's pretty good right now. This was early 2019. They're saying like, what's going to enable you guys to grow the quickest, right? What is going to be able to, like, what do you guys want to focus on? Is it like the core card? Is it, do you guys want to build out, to your point, another Expensify, another Concur, another Certify? And, we didn't have any great ideas on like how we could vastly improve that system. In fact, I had used Abacus over at Coinbase, and I really liked that system, and I actually kept in touch with one of the founders there, Ted Power. And when we got the initial acquisition offer, I reached out to Ted, and I was just like, hey, like we're thinking about this. And I wasn't reaching out to him initially to think that they could be a potential suitor as well. I just kind of really wanted to get his advice, because we weren't that good with reimbursements. We weren't that good with the accounting integrations. So I really wanted to just get his advice there. And one thing led to another. And, he was saying like, hey, his company was acquired by what was then called Certified Chrome River, which is all owned by this PE company called K1 Investments. And they were potentially interested. And suddenly we had like two potential suitors. So I was like, oh, this isn't bad. And, during that time, Brian, to your point, it's like, were we really looking to sell? Were we kind of evaluating? And something that I would recommend to, for folks listening, commit to one. You can't run a business fully while also trying to sell a business. Like, and you do a half-assed job at both, and that's not good, right? So if you're like the Silicon Valley advice, so if you're raising, just kind of limit it to 2 to 3 weeks and try to raise during that entire time period. Similar to, I think, if you're trying to sell. Luckily, Peter and I kind of had split responsibilities. I told Peter, you run the business. I was going to try to sell the company, right? It was a really awkward time because this was when we were all in the office. Our staff, we were about 12 or 13 folks. And there was a lot of diligence materials, and I had to hide away in a separate office because I had diligence calls all day. I had to talk to lawyers, I had to talk to our accountants, I had to prepare all these financial and legal materials, but I couldn't tell my team about it because, the deal's not closed until the deal's closed. And I don't even want to tell the team like, hey, like we're looking at selling because, what does that, they'll start asking, well, what does that mean for me? So it was a super stressful time. But the partners that we found, ultimately K1 and Certified Chrome River, which is now actually they've adopted our name for the broader org, and Burst. Now they've actually allowed us to do what we wanted to do, which was create this card platform that really helps employees take care of their expenses in a super automated fashion, and allowing us to grow faster than we probably could have by ourselves because at the time we were still 13 employees. We had 350-ish clients, and now we have access to I think the last count was over 14,000 companies or so across, I think it's like 110, 120 countries. And so we're able to integrate our card solutions across the 5 or 6 different platforms, and really, instead of working with companies that, our largest company back then was 600 employees. Our largest company now that we're working with is, close to like 80,000 employees.
That's amazing. First of all, I want to say congratulations on that. I mean, having 2 offers is quite amazing, and having been through the entire process is congratulations. Not a lot of people in their lifetime get to experience something like that. So that's a big milestone, big thing for us to celebrate. Since we have a lot of sophisticated listeners on the podcast, I'm pretty sure they're thinking, okay, you're going through an acqui-hire, right? So as you're going through your acqui-hire, what are a couple of things that you had done differently now that you know what you do know, right? I think the first thing is like knowing that you're able to still build on your vision through an acqui-hire is definitely number one. But from a restructuring standpoint, was there some couple of things that you can give us advice on that you learned that could be beneficial if someone who are listening right now was going through an acqui-hire of their own?
So I kind of ask them like, what is important to them, right? So we rejected kind of what turned out to be the first offer because it was kind of a pure acqui-hire. And how I would differentiate between acqui-hire versus kind of a little bit of a smaller or smaller mid acquisition size, which was more in line with what we were doing, is like, do you get to pay back all your investors, right? Typical acqui-hires, you retain all the employees and they have slightly higher, they'll have a signing bonus, or they'll have slightly larger equity packages than regularly hired employees. We had a lot of friends and family that contributed to our multiple seed rounds, and we felt that it was important to make sure that they were all paid back. So, we prioritized that. Like, we wanted them to get something. Second, our early employees made a lot of sacrifices in terms of salary, in terms of what else that they could have been doing, in terms of their lives to work for Inverse. And we wanted to make sure that they were taken care of, just from the onset. Like, if they wanted to leave, like we were going to allow them to leave. We didn't want to golden handcuff them, that they were there just kind of begrudgingly. So that was important for us as well. That like the eventual acquirer takes care of the team, not just, they're not just acquiring us for purely the technology, or they're not acquiring us purely for like myself or Peter, but we come as a package. And lastly, like Peter and I worked our asses off for years as well. We want to be taken care of course, as well. But we were okay in this case with a little bit of a delayed gratification. We knew what we were getting into. So, in terms of, you have to consider all those factors when considering when do you want to be paid out? Is it immediately, later on? Is it cash? Is it stock? Is it, are you handcuffed? Yes or no? Like, how long, vesting schedules? So those are all factors that it's good to have your own prioritizations kind of set out before you engage in negotiations with the buyer. Like, know what's important.
Thanks for sharing that, Roger. You talked about you and Peter working your asses off, right? And you definitely wanted to be taken care of as well, which brings us to our next question, which we really like talking about this as well in this podcast, is we want to know how you manage your mental health, as an entrepreneur, going through an acquisition. I mean, there was, scaling and building your business to such a large scale. I'm sure that, there are times where you feel extremely stressed out, or you feel like, there's just a lot on your plate. But how do you personally deal with mental health, and how do you, keep yourself afloat?
That's a great question. And that's something that I think I have continually evolved in kind of how I deal with, my mental sanity, mental health. I am very fortunate to have a loving wife, as well as a crazy, super loving dog. I have a German Shepherd that kind of keeps me sane, even if I'm like super down. I have hobbies that kind of keep me in line, as well as I mentioned earlier, a great friends and advisor network that really kind of helps me there. So in terms of kind of like hobbies, I enjoy type 2 fun activities. So activities that are like not fun when you're doing it, but only after you achieved it. So whether it's like doing a really, really long trail run, or climbing a really tall mountain, that type of activity literally allows me to focus in the pain of the moment, and it really helps me relieve a lot of stress. I also have the benefit of being able to share these activities with, like I mentioned before, my wife, my dog, and a couple of my closest friends, that were able to do these things and really kind of provide me that level of stress relief. I used to, when I was younger, like I did not do any athletics, like at all. I was this tall, skinny, scrawny kid, didn't do any physical activity unless it was absolutely necessary. I still got my A's in gym because, GPA and all, but like beyond that, like I didn't do any physical really activity. But now like I think it's a combination of like working on my physical health as well as my mental health. They really kind of support each other. So I've found like some days like I don't want to work on my mental health like at all. If I'm like super stressed, I don't want to meditate. I don't want to talk it out. I just don't want to do any of that. I would just go out and beat my body up on a super long run, right? Or go to the gym and start hitting some stuff. Like I think that's helped me a lot to have a couple options to select from on, well, how do I need to go to sleep at the end of the day. How do I do so, right? Like what is my venting mechanism for that day or for that issue that I'm dealing with?
Yeah, that is definitely an outlet of promoting good mental health. And I love the delayed gratification mindset of your type 2 activities.
Yeah. I mean, statistics shows that, if you have delayed gratification, the more successful you be later on in life. So that definitely you're proving something right for us right now, that theory. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been a struggle. So I'm in the Tahoe Reno area these days, and I'm not able to get out as much, unfortunately, because of all the smoke here.
Oh man, it's definitely a lot of fires up there. Please stay safe. So we have one final question for you. That question is, what one advice do you have for an aspiring entrepreneur looking to get into their first startup?
That's a great question. I really question, like, am I the right person to ask about that, right? Like, I kind of just, I'll tell you why I got into my first startup, and maybe this will help someone, maybe it wouldn't. I saw that things were super inefficient, and I didn't see other products within the market that could do it better, right? And something in me was just like, this is so inefficient the way that folks were doing expenses that it bothered me, and that was more conviction than it wasn't like if you I think you have to start if you have the mentality like I want to create a unicorn, I want to create a decacorn, like that will sustain you for some bits, but like when you're really struggling or when the startup's not doing well, like I don't know if that would not be enough conviction for myself, right? Maybe for some it would be, but for me it wouldn't have been. So there was something about that a problem that I identified that just kind of really bothered me, and inefficiency that I wanted to address, and that's what spurred my joining Peter in the early days of Inverse.
Love it. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Roger. So where can our listeners find out more about you and Inverse online?
So to find out anything about Inverse, I mean, you can just look us up. Inverse, that's with an E, like reimburse, but it is an actual old word, and we were so fortunate to be able to get that domain for pretty cheap. That was all Peter. So kudos to him on thinking of that word. I didn't know that word. To find out about me, I mean, my email's just roger@inverse.com. You can reach out to me at any time. You can also find me on Instagram, LinkedIn. I don't tweet really. But yeah, they can find me on standard social media channels.
Thank you, Roger. We will leave all of that in the show notes of this podcast. It was amazing hearing your story today. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you, guys. Excellent questions.
Of course. Thank you for being on the show, Roger. I mean, definitely appreciate everything you shared so far. And, I hope our listeners find a lot of value.